Well, hello, I'm Dr. Mary Mulway, and I'm very honored to be with you here today and to be able to present some information to you that I hope you will find valuable. So, today I'll be speaking to you about the sensory system and how that's related to reading disabilities and challenges that our kids face with literacy. So, let me put this into present mode. I'm going to move my photo over a little bit. There we go. There we go. There we go. So just a little bit about me, just an overview of kind of my education experience and how it relates to our presentation today is I currently serve as the assistant head of school at Park Academy. That is a private school in just outside Portland, Oregon for dyslexia. I have nearly 30 years in education, 15 of those as a reading specialist. I do hold a doctorate in educational leadership. I'm an adjunct professor. I do have a private practice that focuses on primary and postural reflex integration, and I am a core in training with MNRI, which is Moscatova Neurosensory Motor Reflex Integration, and I'm an instructor for brain gym and rhythmic movement training. So, all that being said, that's what I bring to the table today. So let's get right into the sensory system. So by the end of our talk today, I hope that you have a general understanding of the various sensory systems, the relationship between the sensory system and literacy, and that you're able to identify some of the signs of an immature sensory system, and then understand how to address those deficits for better student outcomes. Now, I will say that this presentation could be 4 or 5 days long, 8 hours a day. This is really just, dipping our toes in the water, as we would say in the US, and just getting a little bit of information to perhaps broaden your understanding of some of the underlying causes of reading challenges. So, what is it that good reading requires? It requires solid oral language development, a strong auditory and visual processing system, ocular motor skills, which are the eye's ability to actually move and work together, which we'll talk about more later, executive functioning, which encompasses self-regulation, attention, inhibition, working memory, and then long-term memory. And all of these things have to work together for a child to be a proficient and fluent reader. So this is called Scarboroughs Rope. It's a really great visual about all the pieces that go into proficient reading. So up in the left-hand corner here, you'll see language comprehension, and this is the oral language development. Now, dyslexia is a receptive and expressive language disorder, and that is all up here. Can students receive and produce language both orally and in written form? This includes reading well and fluently. So that includes background knowledge and vocabulary and language structures, syntax and semantics, verbal reasoning, understanding of literacy like concepts about print and things like that. And then below that, down here, we have word recognition. That's phonological awareness, decoding, and sight recognition. Now, these are the things that most educators think are what reading is, but you see this huge role that language comprehension plays in that. Now, what we're going to talk about today, the sensory system, is really all down here in this lower left-hand corner. How does the sensory system affect these skills right here? So, when the brain reads, there is a series of events that happen in nanoseconds, just the tiniest little bit of time. And I am simplifying this for sure, but I wanted you to have an understanding of kind of how this moves through the brain. So when you first see a word, your eyes take it in. You silently identify the first letter. So like in bat, we pick up the B. Your brain translates that to a sound, B. The auditory system is then activated. The auditory system activates the visual word form area, which is back here right above the occipital lobe. And then the brain goes through the visual word form area and neurologically identifies the word off an orthographic map, which is kind of like the lexicon of stored words that we have. And it continues to go through the sounds and the word to look through this lexicon and identify the word. And the auditory and visual systems must work independently and collectively, efficiently for this to happen for a proficient reader. I love this graphic, so kudos to Hemispheres in the UK for developing this. But I think this really gives us a clear understanding of how many layers of things go underneath the academic skills. So if you look way up here at the top in purple, academic and functional performance, this is where reading is, way up here at the top. And notice right below that is language processing and learning, organization, sequencing, and planning. Now look all the way at the bottom, and you will see the vestibular, proprioceptive, and tactile systems, followed by vision, smell, taste, and auditory. Here we are. All of our sensory systems are down here at the very bottom of this pyramid. And what this should say to you is that if we're targeting all of our efforts up here, but the real issue is down here, we're missing the mark. We can do all the fluency activities we want to, but if we haven't addressed the underlying issues, the student is not going to be able to receive the full benefit of those. So let's talk about sensory system development. So infants are born with very little ability to process sensory input. They are a bit of a blank slate. The most dominant way that they interpret the world is through their neurotactile system. And that's in the mouth via sucking. Everything goes in the mouth for a baby, and the skin via touch. It's so important for infants to get lots and lots of touch and cuddling and pressure because it activates their brain. After birth, the rest of the sensory system begins to pattern out through archetype movements and the primary and postural reflex patterns. And we'll talk quite a bit about those as we go through this presentation. Now, a baby has a very immature nerve net when they are born. And these movements, these reflex patterns, develop out this nerve net. So they have all the neurons they need at birth, but by 3 months, the synapses or the connections between these neurons have increased 20-fold. So they have the neurons, but they have to connect, and then those pathways have to get myelinated so that messages can travel down them. So movement, these primary reflex patterns and archetype movements, and sensory experiences actually are what develop this nerve net and increase these synapses. When the nerve net is fully developed and myelinated, sensory information is processed correctly, efficiently, and effectively. So what about those primary and postural reflex patterns? You'll also hear them called primitive reflex patterns. It depends whose work you're reading. So these are specific movement patterns that emerge and integrate at specific times. So integrate means that they're no longer dominant, but that we could use them if we needed to, but that they're not running the show anymore. They're just part of our toolbox. Each movement pattern is genetically encoded. How do we know that? Well, if you have children or nieces or nephews, you know that babies are supposed to do certain things at certain times. We actually have charts for this so that babies push themselves up, they roll over, they start to scoot, they crawl, they creep, and they walk, and it's all supposed to happen in a certain time frame. The reason that we know that is because it's a predictable pattern. It's predictable because it's encoded in our DNA. So when a baby is at conception, their DNA already knows what patterns are supposed to emerge and when. These movements stimulate changes in the brain, creating new pathways through myelination, right? Expanding that nerve net. This develops and matures the entire sensory system. So let's look at just a few of these patterns. These are the three that are most often associated with reading disabilities. This one is the asymmetrical tonic neck reflex, or ATNR. I call it the fencer pose. This begins to develop in utero, and it should be integrated about the 9th week of life. It establishes bilaterality, that there are two sides of the body. It myelinates the auditory pathways. It separates the head and arm movement. So up until then, if a baby moved its head, the whole body would go with it. So now all of a sudden they're like, oh, I can turn my head and nothing else moves with it. It enables them to cross the midline of their body, and it affects visual tracking. When babies are in this position in utero, it actually helps them get through the birth canal. They are moving side to side, and it's pushing them through the birth canal. And babies use this position also for nursing. And when they're up against mommy, the ear that's not up against mommy is the ear that is developing and listening, and those auditory pathways are being developed. And then when they switch sides to nurse, it's the other side. So this is how we develop by oral, or hearing that's differentiated in both ears. The STNR, or symmetrical tonic neck reflex, this is a postural reflex. It gets babies off the floor. So they were crawling on their bellies or doing the commando crawl, and now all of a sudden they've learned how to get up on all fours. This reflex is so important for reading, so important. It separates the limbs from the head and the trunk. So up until this point, the body thought the baby was just one piece, like a log, and they were rolling around on the floor, and they were sliding around on their belly. But up until the STNR, the head and the arms and the trunk and the legs were really one piece neurologically, and now suddenly they can all be moved independently. When babies are down on the floor doing their contralateral movement when they're creeping, in the United States we call this crawling. It is developing their near-point vision as they look up and around, and their visual accommodation, which is the eye's ability to move to different places. It develops muscle tone, develops contralateral movement, like when you are walking and your legs and arms are moving in an opposite pattern. And it develops the corpus callosum, or the white matter between the brain, which operates as the superhighway. About 90% of the time when I assess a kiddo with a reading challenge, the STNR either never emerged, they never crawled, or it is not integrated, it is stuck. And it is causing some significant issues for them, both physically in their gross motor coordination and neurologically in the effectiveness of their vision system and in their executive function. This is the Moro reflex. It's also called the startle reflex. This it should integrate by 4 months. It is present at the moment of birth. The Moro reflex is actually what allows the baby, once it comes out of the birth canal or removed by C-section, to reach back, take a deep breath, and cry. It's the Moro reflex that enables that. The Moro reflex stays with us for life. It is a survival reflex. It integrates, though, at 4 months of age and can be used in an older child and adult. It becomes the fight or flight reflex. So this is a survival reflex over the lifetime. This is the way that a baby informs the world that something is wrong, whether it's hot, cold, hungry, wet, needs to go to sleep. If it heard a loud noise, the only response is a Moro response. This is really important because at this stage, all of the senses are operating as one unit. One unit. If the Moro reflex is retained beyond the 4 months, you will see a variety of challenges. from poor impulse control, focus, attention, emotional regulation, cognitive regulation, crossing the midline, working memory. Why? Because this is the fight or flight reflex. And there are a host of physiological reactions that go with the fight or flight reflex being active. And that is that eyes diverge away from the midline. The middle ear actually clamps down in a stress response, and it reduces the frequencies that the human ear can hear, mostly those of the human voice. So when we're talking about phonological processing deficits and auditory processing deficits, the Moro is a good place to look for that. The brain perceives that it's in danger, and so it is always scanning the environment. So you might see kids who seem like they're inattentive because they're always looking around. Because the brain thinks it's in danger, it thinks the cougar's coming to eat it, as our ancient ancestors might have been worried about. And so the Moro being active, because it's the first reflex we see at birth, can impact every reflex that's supposed to emerge after that. And if the Moro stays active, you will see some significant cognitive issues result as a result of that, and learning challenges. So sometimes issues in cognition may not directly affect reading. It depends on what they are, but with this one, it will. Okay. So let's talk about immature sensory development. So when reflexes do not emerge on time or they're retained past the point they were supposed to integrate, the sensory system will not develop fully. In the early stages of development, as I mentioned, all of the senses operate together. So any stimulus, whether that's touch or sound or sight or hunger, activates the Moro reflex. Over time, though, these differentiate and mature, and so that each sensory system can operate independently and cooperate together. So even though they're interdependent, one will not set off the other necessarily. And a differentiated and mature sensory system is required for fluent and proficient reading. Now, we normally think of reading just involving the auditory and visual systems, but if you think about that pyramid that I showed you, tactile, proprioception, and vestibular were actually on the bottom. Those are foundational sensory systems, and they all begin developing in utero. So let's talk about neurotactile first. So neurotactile is a very complex system. It acts as a connector between the peripheral and central nervous system, and we have lots and lots of receptors. We have pain receptors, we have touch receptors, heat receptors. Those are all part of pressure. Those are all part of neurotactile. And when their neurotactile system is activated, it helps in the production of neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin, the creation of oxytocin, which is that chemical that is so important in social interaction and bonding. It connects to the RAS, or reticular activation system, which is where 99% of sensory information is filtered first. And the RAS is very involved in executive function with attention and keeping the brain at the correct level of arousal. So an underdeveloped neurotactile system can really prevent the brain from getting the appropriate information it needs to regulate itself. Now, in some research, proprioception is thought of as a subset of the neurotactile system. Proprioception is where we are in space. So we have receptors in our joints and in our muscles. And when we move or when we push into something, we get information that's sent to the brain about where our body is in space. But if those proprioceptors are underdeveloped, sometimes we see this in high-risk pregnancies or when there's multiples and there wasn't enough movement in utero, or there was a preemies. This is very common in preemies. So the brain is not getting the correct information about where it is in space. And so it's always having a bit of a panic attack because it doesn't know where its being is. And remember that the brain's first responsibility is to keep us safe, to keep us from the cougar eating us or from us falling down or and so if it doesn't know where we are, it can't do that. And so it's constantly setting off that moro or that fight or flight reflex because it's not sure where we are. And then the vestibular system, which is our balance system. And the balance system is regulated in the middle ear, and it is very connected to the auditory system. In fact, the vestibular and auditory nerves connect and become the eighth cranial nerve. So, like the proprioceptive system, the vestibular system gives our brain input, not necessarily about where our whole body is in space, but about our angle and our head tilt. And the vestibular system helps keep our head and our body righted so that we don't fall down and get eaten by the cougar. And there's three different types of vestibular, and that's spinning around and round and up and down and then back and forth, like swinging. And all of those motions have to be regulated, and that vestibular system has to be mature for the auditory and visual systems to then mature after. So these three are the foundational systems that allow the next systems to develop. And so if there's weaknesses here, there will be weaknesses above them as well. So how is the sensory system involved in reading? Well, let's talk about auditory processing first. So auditory processing is the main mechanism by which we develop phonological awareness, right? Phonological awareness is a subset of auditory processing, which we use for rhyming and phonemic awareness and syllabication. Also, the alphabetic principle that there is a letter and a sound that go together. And the auditory processing system activates the visual word form area so that we can recognize the words that we have read and find them in that orthographic map. There are two auditory pathways. There's the classical and non-classical pathway. And the non-classical pathway develops first and is activated by a variety of stimuli. Remember when I was talking about the moro reflex, that all of the senses are activating every time there's any kind of input? Well, that's the non-classical pathway. And when the auditory system is on this pathway, it is less specific and it does not discriminate sound as well. This may show up as poor auditory discrimination, which equals poor phonological processing. So our goal is for kids to move past the non-classical pathway. And when they come to school, they should already be operating on a classical pathway. But a lot of kids, I would say 90% of the kids we get in the lower grades are still operating on this non-classical pathway because their other sensory pathways have not been myelinated, and so the sensory systems have not differentiated. So let's talk about the vision system. And there's kind of two parts to this. There is the neurological side on the left here, visual processing, and then there's the actual motor coordination side and ocular motor, the physical side of vision. And both of these are involved in reading. Now, vision issues themselves are not the cause of dyslexia, and I'm really speaking here about ocular motor right now. But I find in kids with reading challenges and dyslexia specifically that about 85% of them also have ocular motor challenges. And so we do need to look at this as one of the fundamental reasons why kids may struggle with reading. So let's talk about visual processing first. So visual processing has lots of sub-skills in there. Discrimination, figure ground, perception, closure, working memory, and then long-term visual memory. All of these are used in reading, like visual discrimination. Can I tell the difference between two letters that are similar, like a B and a P, or a B and a D? Different fonts, different colored fonts. Visual closure is the ability to see the other part of something. Like if you saw half a face, your brain would fill it in. Well, we also use that for reading. So those issues on the left are the neurological processes of vision, and then the ocular motor are the physical skills. Remember that the muscles in the eyes are fine motor muscles, so they develop after our gross motor muscles, just like speech is also fine motor. And so these ocular motor skills, there's about 7 of them. I just listed some of them here for you. Eye tracking, also called visual pursuits by an optometrist. Binocularity, that we have 2 eyes and that they work together in team. Visual accommodation, which is the ability of our eyes to move, like look up at the board and look down and then look over here and come back. That's visual accommodation. And then fixation is the ability to fixate on something or look at it for a long period of time and take that in without our eyes moving around. And all of these things have to be in place and matured for a child to be a proficient and expedient reader. So what is the collective impact of these underdeveloped systems? Well, underdevelopment of the foundational systems, neurotactile, proprioceptive, and vestibular, um, impacts the higher systems like vision and auditory. So these 3 systems give the brain very important information. Improper information will consistently activate the moral response. And vestibular, auditory, and visual systems are all interconnected, like I mentioned about the 8th cranial nerve. If a child has an immature vestibular system, they will use their eyes to keep their balance, which puts all the stress on the vision system. And then when they're trying to read and their eyes are moving across the page, their brain thinks that they are not in the brain's not getting the right information about the head tilt because their eyes are moving. And so you'll see kids a lot stabilize themselves while they're reading so that their head doesn't move as a result of this. One question I get a lot is, why is the moral reflex active in kids? And we see this a lot in kids who were C-sections or who were preemies and who had traumatic births, or hypoxic, the cord was wrapped around the neck, so there was oxygen deprivation. Because when babies come through the birth canal, really important things are supposed to happen neurologically. That compression and the movement and the reflexes that create the movement from the canal all start things off neurologically. And so if they don't receive that experience, the moral reflex may not get triggered to start its process, or the shock of the C-section, the shock of the oxygen deprivation, or whatever the complication was, getting stuck in the birth canal, can cause that moral reflex and then its partner, fear paralysis, to be activated and stay activated, right? So we need the moro to take that first breath, but it gets stuck on and doesn't go away. It's a very high correlation between kids with significant reading challenges and having some kind of complication at birth, in my experience. All right, so weaknesses in the sensory processing system actually divert cognitive energy away from the neocortex. So the brain develops in a certain pattern, right? So the cerebellum is concerned with gross motor coordination and actually speech and language to a lesser extent, but that's for a different talk. And then we get up into the right above the brainstem, and we're working into the midbrain, and we're looking at the basal ganglia and the thalamus. And then we get up here into the neocortex, which is actually where language learning occur, and then the prefrontal cortex, which is the home of executive functioning. So if we're still working with sensory processing and gross motor coordination, we are stuck in the lower parts of the brain. And it's like when you don't have enough working memory on your computer and it just spins. in the background and you can't really get it to do what you want it to do, that's because all the energy of the computer is working towards these background processes, and you don't have enough bandwidth for that to occur and do something else. That's very similar to a child's brain when they're still having issues with sensory processing, gross motor coordination, is that there's just not enough cognitive energy to get moved up into this neocortex, and certainly not the prefrontal cortex, because we're still working on the basic patterns trying to keep this little human alive and not eaten by the cougar. I just love this graphic. I don't even know where it came from, of the features of executive function, but I thought it was worth mentioning because that's the last thing to develop is prefrontal cortex and executive function. And these are the 8 major processes of executive function. And if you look over here, flexible thinking, working memory, and self-monitoring. These are so important to reading. And actually, a good friend of mine, Michael Solis, out of the University of California, Riverside, did a study on self-regulation and reading with another colleague of his, and how important it is as a piece of that puzzle. And the research is really starting to come out that way, that kids who consistently do not progress in reading, there is quite often an issue in executive function, where all the energy has been focused on phonemic awareness and word attack, that these neurological processes of self-regulation, inhibition, working memory are so impactful to reading. All right, so at this point in the presentation, I hope you have some basic understanding of the sensory systems and how they impact reading. But let's talk about how you would recognize that as an educator, right? You haven't done all this training and you're not sure what to look for. So I'll go over some of that with you. So one is looking at the way a child moves their body and at their posture. So you see up here in the top here, this child is W sitting. This is a clear marker for an active STNR. So we know that this child's going to have issues in the midline, probably some low muscle tone, some problems with gross motor coordination, and thus fine motor coordination. This kiddo over here in the lower corner here, this is a clear indicator of the ATNR. When they have to hold their posture, it's because when they move their head or move their arm when they write, their head turns because of that fencer pose. So they have to posture themselves. Another common accommodation for that is to turn their body sideways, so that they can, or turn their paper sideways so that they can turn their head and it doesn't cause movement of the rest of their body. And this is another good indicator. You see this kiddo here in this picture, that his back is not up against the chair, because this is a good indicator of the STNR, because his brain still thinks that he's one piece and that he can't segment his parts. So this kiddo, who's all nice and integrated, he can segment his body into different pieces, but this kiddo cannot. You'd also see kids up out of their seat often, asking to stand up a lot, fidgeting in their chair. They just seem like they can't get comfortable. W sitting in their chair. These are all common things to look for posturally. Sensitivity to textures or clothing would be a good indication of an immature neurotactile system. Poor personal space, frequent falling or bumping into things, being very rough at play, always like banging into things, would be an indicator of poor proprioception. And then poor balance, avoiding certain types of play, stabilizing themselves while they read, often getting car sick. Those are all indicators of a underdeveloped vestibular system. So auditory. So we might have a kiddo who seems to miss directions. They mishear tone of voice. They might be a kid who says, "Why are you yelling at me?" or "He was being mean to me," because they can't hear the tone of voice correctly. They might be sensitive to loud noises. They may be that kid that hears the clock ticking or papers rustling in the background, but they don't hear you. Remember, we talked about that inner ear clamping down and reducing the frequencies that a child can hear. And the hallmark of dyslexia is poor phonological processing, which you would see in rhyming and phonemic awareness. And then for vision, children might skip letters or words or lines of text. They may, you'll see them like reread the same word or jump back and pick up part of a sentence again. They may hold their paper or body at an unusual angle. They avoid reading tasks altogether. They rub their eyes or they get watery eyes. They reverse letters vertically or horizontally. That's a visual perception issue. They may make errors copying, or their handwriting is crooked, slanted, or poorly spaced. So those are just some things to look for as an educator that might indicate to you that there are some sensory issues that are underneath the actual reading issue. So now, what do you do about it as a classroom teacher, right? You're not an occupational therapist or a physiotherapist, I think is what you call them in Europe. So what do we do about that? So for neurotactile, these are some great strategies. We use them all the time at my school. So this one is just the squeeze. And so like the diagram, you just start at the wrist, right above the wrist, and you give a nice squeeze. And you do that to both arms and both legs several times a day. That activates these pressure sensors and also the proprioceptors. Using a weighted blanket can be very effective because it is constantly giving input, like when it's laid across the lap, to the brain, so that it activates that neurotactile system. And feet stomping. I love this one. You notice that when young children get angry, they stomp their feet and they seem to feel better afterwards. Well, it's a good reset for the brain. So you can have the kids get up and stomp their feet really hard, and that activates all of the sensors, proprioceptors and neurotactile. So for neurotactile or for proprioception, you can do all the same ones we just talked about, plus heavy lifting, pushing and pulling, crawling, push-ups, other weight-bearing activities, or wiggle seats like the one that I showed here. And we have these for all of our third graders. They all have a wiggle seat so that as they're sitting there, they can still get that input so that their brain knows where they are and that they're okay. So for vestibular, all kinds of balance activities. So balance boards, balance foam, balance beams, trampoline, swinging, rocking, spinning. All of these help develop that vestibular system. For auditory, there are a couple of listening therapies out there that are really effective. The Safe and Sound protocol is one that works really well to reduce that stress in the middle ear and allow the frequencies to open up so they can hear more of them. I actually did this one myself after my TBI a couple years ago. It was a lifesaver. Soundsory is a different listening therapy, really helps with that sensory integration. This forebrain device here, we use this in our reading classes with some of our kids, and it has amplification through the microphone, and then these create bone conduction, which activates the auditory nerve. So when they speak into it, they hear it much louder, and it creates this bone conduction so that it starts the process auditorily of processing that sound. It can be a lifesaver for kids with speech issues. You can combine phonemic awareness activities with balance activities. Like I said, the vestibular system and auditory system are connected. We can do lazy eights. This is from Brain Gym, and cross crawls, also from Brain Gym. These are very good to cross the midline of the body and get those messages moving across the corpus callosum. For visual, cross crawls, lazy eights, the cat-cow from yoga. This is also an activity from rhythmic movement training. And then Kenneth Lane is an optometrist here in the United States. And he has a whole series of books. So this one is eye tracking, but he also has perception and discrimination. And we actually use these in our reading classes to help develop these skills for kids. And then, of course, a neuro-optometrist or developmental or behavioral optometrist, they go by all three, can do vision therapy with kids to really help. And I refer about 90% of the kids that I assess over to a neuro-optometrist for vision therapy. They can do a full assessment and do some therapy with them. And then, of course, multisensory instruction, which is the number one recommendation for the International Dyslexia Association. We do it a little bit different. I call it systems loading. Remember, I talked about that non-classical pathway and all the senses are still operating together. So we incorporate as many senses as we can simultaneously. So you can have kids on a balance board doing phonemic awareness activities, or using foam letters, or stomping their feet hard when they're spelling out loud, or rotate using letters and sounds together and then separately, and using different textures for students to spell or trace letters on. The idea is that the more you use the senses together, use them together, separately, that classical pathway will begin to develop, and then students can use them independently. And you will see a great increase in their auditory processing and visual processing skills. And then here at the end, I just provided you some resources. These are some of the people that I refer to in my work, and that I have that I appreciate their work and has informed my practice. The link to my TED Talk is there as well. And here are some resources for training or the devices that I mentioned in my presentation. And this is my contact information. So I really appreciate your time, and I'm open to all kinds of questions that you may have. So I'm going to stop the presentation now and take your questions. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, and thank you for allowing me to be part of this conference today.